Hi there, this is Michael Bovee with Consumer Recovery Network, and welcome back to our YouTube channel. Today I want to discuss something that I've actually been meaning to for quite some time, at least in a video, and that is debt validation. It's found in the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, and it's an important right. There are reasons why you need to have the ability to request validation of a debt. Especially today with rampant identity theft. What if you don't recognize a debt because your identity's been compromised? Accounts opened up in your name and suddenly now collectors are calling you and writing to you. You had no idea and you had no involvement. There was fraud. This is how you can get to the bottom of it. Debt validation is an important right when you don't recognize necessarily who's trying to collect, right? So banks, for example, with credit cards, will send out your account to collection agencies, contingency collection agencies that just call and write to you in an effort to get you to pay the original creditor. Actually, if you were to pay, you'd be paying it to the order of the original creditor. Banks also, and you need to be able to recognize if it's a legitimate debt collector contacting you on behalf of your creditor. But banks also sell debts into the open market. They sell the legal rights to collect from you to debt buyers. These are investors that pay perfectly good money to purchase up the legal rights to collect on debts that haven't been paid, and it's profitable, at least enough to keep them doing it. And sometimes it's hard to recognize who those people are. Why are you collecting from me? Why do you say I owe you and I'm paying you now? So debt validation helps you get to the bottom of that stuff. However, it can become problematic for someone who just simply wants to resolve their debt. You know the debt's yours, and you want to get over it. You want to get beyond whatever financial setback you had in the past you've recovered from, or at least recovered enough to try and resolve each one of your debts, maybe one by one. And there's this, and has been, a push, especially online, to describe debt validation as one of those legal rights that you should always follow through on. And that's actually not necessarily appropriate when really all you're looking to do is, say, negotiate a debt or pay it off. Obviously, I'm very fond of debt settlement, especially with debts that are already in collection, because they're already in collection. The damage is already done to your credit report. You're not necessarily getting bonus points because you pay off an entire amount owed in collection that is now inflated with all the fees. Negotiating an affordable payoff is certainly an option most of the time. I talk about it a lot on the site and on our YouTube channel here. But if that's your goal, you don't need to send off a written request to a debt collector to validate your debt, because it triggers certain things on their part that you potentially want to avoid, especially when all you have to do is pick up the phone, call your original creditor, and verify with them who they place the account with. In fact, often they're going to forward you over through an automated connection to the debt collector, or tell you who the debt buyer is. So you can get your validation and circumvent this whole written request, but I want to talk about why it can become problematic. So let's say, for example, that XYZ Bank has sold your debt to ABC debt collector, or even just placed it with a typical contingency collector and not sold it. They still have the legal right. They just want somebody else to try and collect from you for a time. And you send off this debt validation request. What does that trigger that you might want to avoid? Well, the contingency debt collector may take those kind of responses and kick those accounts back to the original creditor, along with, there's a legal question about this account, therefore we're pushing it back to you. What happens when that occurs often enough, and what you may want to avoid, is that the bank's legal team, they're now going to review your file because there's some kind of extraordinary kind of request coming through. What does that mean? Well, it means that you could next be contacted by an attorney that collects debt. That's something that most of us want to avoid. In other words, you've pushed from, you want to settle this account, you want to pay this account, from a contingency debt collector that you may be typically able to get 30, 40 cents on the dollar type of deals from, and pushed it over back to the creditor, and that deal now may not be achievable, and especially if it's been pushed out to an attorney who collects debt. It also can happen where you're dealing with a debt buyer, somebody who bought your original debt that's now charged off, and that debt buyer, who may not grab all of the media initially that they need to show your debt, they may now have to go and request that if they want to continue collecting from you, and they do have to do that. it's something that you instigate with your letter, that if they want to continue to collect from you, they have to go out and get this documentation so that they can, prove that you owe the debt, certainly, but also now that they have that documentation, it's the kind of thing that they need to sue you. So you've just armed the debt buyer with everything needed to press the issue in your local court in order to get you to pay, when really, if your goal was to just negotiate a settlement, you could have just gotten that done. So those are some of the problematic ways you can use debt validation. And again, please understand, this video is not about whether or not you owe a debt and you need validation of that from somebody when there's fraud involved, like identity theft, or you're just simply trying to evade payment, which is a legitimate strategy. Debt validation, I call it the debt validation boogie, I have for years. Doing that dance can yield to not having to pay a debt, having it go from one debt collector to the next debt collector to the next debt collector. And if that's your goal, it may or may not be accomplished in that process. But this whole everybody must request validation of a debt from a debt collector, when all you really want to do is just get this one behind you, that's really bad advice in a lot of cases. A couple of other things that I want to touch on. Most of the debt validation requests that I've seen over the years, and I've been doing this kind of work for a little over 20, are overly broad. I mean, I call them kitchen sink letters, basically because everything in that letter, including the kitchen sink, is in there. When the barrier for a debt collector to meet their obligation to validate your debt is low enough for them to trip over on the way to the water cooler at work. That means that these requests where you're asking for wet ink signatures of your original credit contract that probably don't exist because you might have opened the account online, so there is no wet ink signature. The fact that you used the card and paid a bill establishes you knew you were obligated to the account. So all of this stuff that goes into these letters, all this verbose, 2 pages of all this stuff, it's the kind of thing that I'm pretty sure started to get thrown in there because it's the kind of thing that you can request from a debt collector when you're being sued in the discovery process. It's the kind of information that your attorney is going to ask them to step up with during litigation. And again, most of us just want to avoid that. And debt validation requests, as relates to the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, that's kind of, you're too late for that if you're in litigation. You already have discovery rules in your state that apply. So it's not something that has its place having all of the stuff that you're going to ask for, because it's not even required of them. And the fact is, again, reiterated, you just want to resolve a debt. And all of that information is not something that is consistent with that goal. So when you're online and you're looking at, oh, here's a tool, here's something great I would use to, you could use to send to your creditors or debt collectors in request of debt validation, it's not that complicated. It's actually really, really simple. And your goal, in most cases, for people that have a legitimate concern about whether I owe this debt to this debt collector or this amount, those are the kind of things that you're getting to the bottom of. And of course, again, you can call your creditor and get that information. But this helps me jump into a major topic of debt validation and how I see it being abused by profiteers. The debt validation boogie, that dance that I referred to earlier, where XYZ debt collector gets the account, and years and years ago, and even I used to use this on behalf of customers, you could get the account kicked off back to the creditor because the debt collector got your validation request. Creditor gets it and it says, okay, we'll just push this down the line, and another debt collector gets it, you send that validation request. And then it goes back to the creditor. Eventually the creditor sells it off to a debt buyer. Debt buyer contacts you, you send that validation request off, and you look like somebody who's just not low-hanging fruit. They want to collect from people that have the ability and willingness to pay. Those two ingredients are what collectors are limited to. That's what they want to focus their time on. And you sending debt validation request letters means you're neither willing or able, one of the two or both, to pay. So they're going to spend their time on other accounts. It's not like that anymore. Years ago it was, but that debt validation boogie used to be effective, and in some instances it still can be today. But what profiteers do, and what I consider in a lot of cases to be scammers, they build this entire program of letter writing and requests out on paper, and then they sell it, or they have affiliate marketers sell it as some debt invalidation. In other words, they're taking a known right that's already covered and talked about quite a bit online and stretching it out to mean something other, or to effectuate something other than what it was originally designed to do. And they charge thousands of dollars. I just recently have heard of a few cases. One where the guy had almost about $100,000 worth of debt. He had already paid about $8,000 in fees to this company to invalidate his debt using these debt validation requests, or at least the initial premise of those letters that were sent were to invalidate the debt. And you can't do that, right? It's just an extrapolation of an important consumer right and taking it to and stretching it out to mean something other than what it really is intended to mean, and then banking on the fact that some very predictable things are going to happen. You know, your credit card bank isn't getting paid. They're going to charge off the debt after 6 to 7 months, 6 months usually, and it's going to get dropped into the collection pipeline consisting of 3 pipes: contingency debt collectors, debt buyers, and attorneys that collect debt. That's what your bank's going to do. And each one of those instances, as they happen, they might have some special sauce letter with obviously verbose and out of context that they might send, and all in the hopes that really all you're doing is the debt validation boogie. And they're having this secret way of handling this with all of these legal questions. Ultimately, what can happen is that you just get sued. You wasted thousands and thousands of dollars in upfront fees that you're probably not going to get back, when in essence all you wanted to do was resolve your debt that you could no longer afford, but you wanted to do something. You wanted to be responsible and take care of whatever part you could at least afford. And that type of process, and again I consider it a full scam, is not helpful. It's counterproductive. You end up owing more. You end up getting sued where you could have avoided it because of all these letters that go out. I want to close with this, and it's repetitious because it's important. If your goal is to resolve a debt with a debt collector of any flavor, requesting validation is often counterproductive, but it has its place. We have ongoing discussion about debt validation on a very dedicated page of the Consumer Recovery website. We have the comments below. We can engage in discussion about that. It's not a place to talk about whether or not banks lend real money or fake money. It's not a place to talk about whether debt collectors have to meet a certain obligation for validation. It's a place to talk about whether or not to strategically use debt validation as a way to help you resolve a debt. It's a great stall tactic in some instances, backfires in others. There's a real good way to go about using this process when all you need to do is figure out whether you owe a creditor, a debt collector, a debt buyer, and you can avoid having to send these letters. Michael Bovee, Consumer Recovery Network. See you on the next video.